All right, let's dive right into this explainer because today we're going to completely reframe a story you only thought you knew. For a lot of us, the title Gulliver's Travels conjures up images of a whimsical children's fairy tale. Maybe a cartoon giant tied down by tiny people on a beach. But when we actually look at the source texts, the academic analyses, and the historical documents from the early 18th century, a completely different picture emerges. Today, we're going to explore how Jonathan Swift's legendary book was actually a calculated, relentless, and intensely savage critique of human nature and political corruption. We're skipping the dry introductions today and coming right out of the gate with this absolutely devastating assessment from the King of Brobdingnag. This quote perfectly captures the surprisingly dark tone of Jonathan Swift's masterpiece. In the story, Gulliver has just spent hours eagerly describing the politics, society, and history of England, basically trying to impress the Giant King. And after hearing all about the wars, the courts, and the lawmakers, the king responds with a breathtaking insult. I mean, wow. He literally calls humanity the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that ever suffered to crawl. It tells us immediately that Swift is definitely not here to write a gentle, breezy travelogue. He is here to draw blood. Part 1. A savage political diss track. Peeling back the fantasy. Part 2. The art of diminution. Shrinking the enemy. You see, Swift was actually a clergyman, but he was deeply tangled up in the political struggles of his day. So he used travel writing as kind of a Trojan horse. It let him comment on explosive real-world issues without, instantly getting thrown into prison for treason. And his primary weapon of choice to attack his enemies? This concept called diminution. Critic John M. Bullitt defines it as a satirical technique aimed at belittling a subject. It's basically using low, vulgar imagery to drag an object, or a person, or an entire political party way down below its usually accepted status. Instead of arguing with his opponents on an intellectual level, Swift used diminution to degrade them. He made them look so petty, physically unappealing, or just plain absurd that you literally couldn't take them seriously. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole concept. Swift physically diminishes humanity right from the start with this incredibly iconic image of a giant tied down by tiny, absurd people. When Gulliver washes ashore in Lilliput, he is a giant among mortals who are just 6 inches tall. But Swift isn't just playing with scale for the fun of it. By shrinking the politicians and royals down to the size of actual bugs, he's literally reducing the stature of the real European monarchies. Suddenly, the mighty rulers of the world just look like these fragile, squabbling little toys that could easily be crushed underfoot. Now, consider how Swift applies this tactic to specific political events. Take the political factions of Lilliput, the high heels and the low heels. In the story, the animosity between these two groups is so intense, they won't even speak to each other, they won't eat together, and the king will only hire low heels for his government. Swift forces us to take a step back and realize, wow, this is incredibly petty. But of course, the high heels perfectly represented the Tories and the High Catholic Church, while the low heels were the Whigs and the Protestant Low Church in England. By turning centuries of bloody, religious, and political warfare into an argument over, of all things, shoe heels, Swift diminishes the entire conflict. He exposes the whole shebang as completely and utterly ridiculous. And looking at the timeline of the novel, we can see how this strategy builds progressively. The satire doesn't just sit still, it escalates. In Voyage 1, to Lilliput, the focus is squarely on petty politics. But then in Voyage 2, Brobdingnag, where Gulliver is now the tiny one, the physical grossness and the flaws of humanity are basically shoved under a microscope. By Voyage 3, to the floating island of Laputa, Swift shifts gears to attack corrupt intellectualism and useless science. And finally, Voyage 4 descends into this overarching total disgust with the entire human race through the Yahoos. He steadily widens his target, going from specific politicians to the very concept of humanity itself. Part 3, Targeting Science and Isaac Newton, the Laputa Connection. As these voyages progress, Swift starts taking aim at some very specific historical giants. He maintains this calculated, almost objective distance in his prose. But make no mistake, he is launching ruthless attacks, none more so than against the absolute titan of the scientific revolution himself. Notice how the absent-minded philosophers of the flying island of Laputa contrast with their real-world inspiration, Isaac Newton. The Laputans are so lost in high-level math and astronomy that they literally need servants called flappers to hit them with rattles just to keep them engaged in a normal conversation. Swift actually got this idea from his friend Catherine Barton, who happened to be Newton's stepniece. She told Swift that Newton was so engrossed in his thoughts he would literally forget to eat. But Swift wasn't just poking fun at an awkward genius.
He portrays the Laputans as people who disastrously try to interfere in state affairs, which was a direct pointed mirror to Newton's real-world political power. Because ultimately, Swift's real hatred for Newton had absolutely nothing to do with gravity or physics. It was deeply, deeply political. You see, in his later years, Newton was the head of the Royal Mint in London, and in 1722, an English manufacturer named William Wood got a patent to impose 360 tons of highly corrupt substandard copper coins onto Ireland. Newton, showing what Swift saw as immense arrogance and colonial superiority, actually approved these incredibly flawed coins. Swift, who was a fierce Irish patriot, was absolutely furious. He actually paused writing Gulliver's Travels just to pen pamphlets attacking this. He didn't view Newton as some scientific hero. To Swift, Newton was a tyrannical bureaucrat forcing debased currency onto a helpless Ireland. Part 4. The Degeneration of Humanity, the Yahoo Nature. So Swift's profound frustration with political corruption, greed, and systemic incompetence eventually metastasized into something much, much darker. He just strips away all human dignity. By the time we reach his fourth and final voyage in the book, he completely abandons specific political beefs for a total existential teardown. He presents us with the Huion Hams, the society of perfectly rational, intelligent, and peaceful horses, and living right beside them, the Yahoos, these savage, filthy, thoroughly disagreeable creatures who are driven entirely by their basest instincts. The horrifying punchline for Gulliver, and for us, the readers, is the realization that these Yahoos are completely indistinguishable from mankind, except for the fact that they don't wear clothes. Swift is taking diminution to its absolute extreme limit here. He's suggesting that human beings aren't reasoning creatures at all, but really just animals barely hiding our savage nature under coats and dresses.
Part 5. A deeply polarized public reception. The world reacts. Now, Swift knew exactly what he was doing with this explosive material. He knew that calling the entire human race a bunch of filthy yahoos was going to rattle the cages of polite society. In fact, he secretly confessed his true motivations to his inner circle before the book even hit the presses. In an excerpt from a letter to his friend, the poet Alexander Pope, written in September 1725, he writes, "Upon this great foundation of misanthropy, the whole building of my travels is erected." He goes on to explain that while he heartily loved individuals, his friends, John, Peter, Thomas, he utterly hated and detested that animal called man. He literally built his masterpiece on an intentional foundation of misanthropy, meaning a general hatred or distrust of the human species. So naturally, when the book was published the very next year, it sparked an explosive reaction. The public reception was instantly and deeply polarized. I mean, his fellow writers and friends like Alexander Pope and John Gay thought it was brilliant. They became enthusiastic fans, even adopting the slang and humorously signing their letters as Yahoos. Henry Fielding praised the book for nobly ridiculing the immoralities of the age. But man, the backlash was fierce. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was a political opponent, spitefully said the authors clearly just wanted to be beasts. Dean Smedley attacked Swift for abandoning his duty as a clergyman, claiming he was teaching the absolute reverse of virtue. And Samuel Richardson, the highly moralistic novelist, was completely appalled, calling the ending the abominable Yahoo story. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought regarding what is arguably the world's most enduring diss track. We've seen how Swift used this brilliant tool of diminution to shrink empires, to turn literal wars into arguments about shoes, and to reduce humanity to the level of feral yahoos. But you have to ask yourself, does Swift's brutal use of this technique to constantly degrade human nature make him nothing more than a cynical, hateful misanthrope? Or was he just an uncomfortably honest observer, holding up a mirror to the corruption and greed that polite societies simply refuse to acknowledge? Keep that in mind the next time you hear someone mention Gulliver's Travels. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.